Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Uplifting Impact podcast. I'm Justin Ponder, Chief Information Officer with Uplifting Impact, and I'm excited to be hosting you today as we dive deeper into our journey to make the world more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Today, I'm very excited to be talking with Rhoan Garnett. Rhoan Garnett PhD is the Director of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility, or IDEA, at the Milwaukee Public Museum. He leads the strategic and programmatic direction for IDEA initiatives, focusing on integrating diversity with the core vision, mission, and values of MPM. Rhoan's heart lies in advancing the museum's commitment to preserve and protect the well-being of our world's natural and cultural diversity. Rhoan is passionate about leveraging mentoring, information, and insights at scale to enable all students the opportunity to earn a degree or certificate towards a successful career, fulfilling life. Rhoan Garnett, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Justin, for having me.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. So you mentioned in our conversation before the interview started that MPM, Milwaukee Public Museum, hired you as an outsider to the Milwaukee community. And you're also new to the museum space. Can you elaborate on that for our listeners?
Yeah, I'm happy to. First of all, I think I do want to acknowledge that the leadership went outside the box a bit and decided to hire someone who hasn't actually worked in a museum space. But I say I'm an outsider because as you mentioned, I'm not from Milwaukee. As I just said, I'm not from the museum space. I'm also not someone with a natural and cultural studies major. I'm someone who got my PhD in education. So in so many ways, I'm someone who's a bit non-traditional, if you will, but I think it sets me up nicely to be a facilitator for much of my life. And I think even just by birth, my experience has been someone who bridges communities for folks. And so I think I mentioned to you when we were getting going that I'm originally from the Virgin Islands. I lived in Maine. I lived in Washington. I lived in Oklahoma, and here I am now living in Wisconsin. And so having that kind of rich, diverse experience allows me to actually have conversation, to show up to people with different experiences. And that's what I mean when I say I'm sort of the person who is almost, fostered to do this kind of bridge and belonging work.
And so how do you feel that having that outsider's experience and kind of bridging these gaps, what has been the best experience or the tips that you've learned on how to bridge these differences?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is just hearing people, it's listening to people's experiences. I'll tell you, Justin, one of the things I find incredibly challenging is, and I suppose we could even sort of frame it in sort of the Milwaukee context in the sense that it's a segregated society, right? And so if we've been living in isolation, it means that voices aren't actually being heard. And so I tell people the power of this concept of a bridge is if we truly want understanding, if we truly want to bridge differences, we have to understand where each other is coming from. And so if you can imagine for a second, if I were to meet someone and we truly wanted to come to know each other, that person might actually decide to go and maybe live in the islands for a bit. Maybe it's going to live in Maine for a bit. And then when they show up to me, there's some experiences that are going to overlap, if you will. There's a Venn diagram of experiences that are going to overlap. And so we can see each other a bit better and we can show up with much more understanding. But what happens when we live in sort of a segregated society, it almost becomes binary. I tell you what my experience has been, and you almost have to counter that by telling me, well, no, this is kind of the way it is because this is the way my experience has been. So we oftentimes aren't honoring people's experiences, and that creates sort of division between people in difference. And so my experience, just as someone who I don't know, been to many places, I always show up in spaces as a student, as someone who is learning. And in that sense, I'm always the facilitator. You know what I mean? It's like, share your experience with me. I'll listen to you and I'll tell you what my experience has been. And I think sometimes that allows for people to sort of build relationships.
And so going in with an attitude of always being a student, always being a facilitator, always listening and always learning, that seems like a fantastic note for everybody out there listening. Write that down. That's what you should do. But on an organizational level, like how do you create the environment where people who aren't inclined, they don't have that personality, they always want to tell you about themselves and they don't want to listen, or they assume that their particular and often privileged experience is the experience. How do you create systems, operations, opportunities at an organizational level to allow for that learning and facilitation to happen across differences? So if you already have a personality to be a bridge builder, how do you create an environment where everyone, even those who aren't already inclined to be bridge builders, can also bridge some build
I
some
appreciate
bridges?
that question a great deal, because that's going to be one of the great challenges here at MPM. It's both this sort of internal engagement and external engagement. Everything I've said to you so far essentially is about me building interpersonal relationships. And I think it's incredibly important, even at an organizational level, in doing this work, to actually build relationships with people across departments, right? And it's not so much as like inviting people to meetings and or inviting guests in to talk to the museum. That stuff is really, really important. But for that internal work, I think a lot of us could do a really good job of actually getting to know each other at a personal level, because what it allows for is for people to be a bit more open, a bit more transparent about things. I talk about this thing of like moving away from us talking about being woke and moving towards talking about our blind spots, right? Like I can imagine if a lot of people were in a space and show up talking about where they can't see themselves, where they can't see how they enter into spaces, that would allow for all of us to sort of show up with a bit more humility. So as I begin my work here, a big part of the way I'm hoping to do this, I think I've already began to do this, is to actually reach out to people at an individual level to get to know folks. And a lot of that is very intentional in terms of the people who've been here, the people who've actually been at MPM for a very long time and who've established relationships with folks. And I tell people the relationship itself is the bridge, right? That relationship would allow me to move to the next one, And that sort of the interpersonal relationships becomes the collection of the network that you need to move through. But for me, I think it begins at a very interpersonal level, engaging with people, letting people know you hear them, allowing people to share their grievances, and some sort of move forward through those relationships.
And now in your title, oftentimes we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but your title is inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility. So for a lot of our listeners who might be focused on DEI, can you talk a little bit about what the accessibility, what that means and what it looks like?
Yeah, I mean, accessibility is essentially, I would sum it up as almost like allowing for a sense of belonging. One of my colleagues here, Dawn, she is the accessibility coordinator. And I've already learned a great deal from Dawn, because one of the things that I haven't necessarily been thinking about, because it hasn't really been my work, is people with disabilities, right? And so making sure that every space in the museum, every exhibition, every gallery is presented in a way that someone who, for example, might be blind can actually interact with that space. So it's been very intentional about creating spaces for people of all backgrounds, all experiences to kind of show up in this space.
And that's a very important point, because lots of times when people hear initially diversity, equity, inclusion, they say, oh, this is about really interracial reconciliation.
That's right.
And then they forget about all the other things along the lines: race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexuality, ability status. And ability status is oftentimes, in my experience, the one. Ability status and age often really get left off. They are the ones that are often the least. And when we talk about ability status, especially, we, I think, constantly overlook the ways in which that affects way more people. There's lots of conversation about invisible disabilities, either chronic pain or mental health management, all these different things that we often don't think about. So that's really important that you address that. And what might be some of the other complexities about kind of this intersectional accessibility and inclusion that you find exciting, the greatest opportunities, and maybe oftentimes the greatest challenges that people overlook? What about this intersectional aspect of greater inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's so just even to touch back on what I just said, like so much of my work has been focused on young people, right? And so to that point about meeting Dawn, and her work is very much situated in the elderly and people with disabilities. And so you begin to see that need to sort of bring different people, the generational piece into the same space. I mean, imagine the learning and the education that could happen when you have young people and their elders operating in the same space. And so that whole bit about being inclusive is something that extends beyond, like you said, the demographics that we tend to sort of focus on. And what I really like to focus on is actually more or less those interactions of demographics, right? That like we sit as people sitting here right now, we are a number of things. We across class, race, and all those things are interacting all at once. One of the things that I would really love to do here, Justin, is to understand who the visitors are coming through our doors, right? Understand the communities that are showing up in our spaces and look very closely and critically at neighborhoods that we aren't actually connecting with. Because I think we have data here that will tell us that. And then, create some sort of marketing strategy to reach out to communities that we haven't typically engaged. And I'll tell you this, and I think I mentioned this when we were getting ready to come on here, that I tend to take an Uber to work. And so I've been having a lot of conversation with people in the community, and I've heard some wonderful stories about people coming to the museum. But what I've noticed also about that is, in many cases, when I'm interacting with people from the Black community, it's oftentimes, I haven't gone to the museum, or I haven't been to the museum in a really long time. That interaction is oftentimes different, I think, when I'm talking to someone who is white, right? There's a whole different experience with the museum. And I think we need to pay attention to that. And it doesn't mean, I think sometimes, again, what happens with folks is that if you do something for one or give attention, it means somehow it takes from the other. It's like, no, what it means is that we need to be a little bit more inclusive. So let's do some targeting on populations or groups of people that we typically haven't served. And so that's some of the work that I'm going to try to figure out how to do here, is to set up something where I'm looking at each department and I'm asking them to think within the context of idea, what has your work look like? And what would you want your work to look like as we go forward? And as I begin to have those conversations, I guarantee you I'm going to tease out some themes that cuts across, I think, what we are hoping to accomplish here at the museum.
And I think you mentioned something that's really valuable to most of our listeners as well. It's like, if you're at a museum, at a public museum, or if you're at an art museum, or you work for a symphony orchestra, or a library, oftentimes there's these spaces, or particular companies that sell a particular product. There very often becomes, either through historical kind of neglect of a particular population or larger cultural events beyond the individual institution's control, the developed sense that that space isn't for me. That space is for them, but it's not for me. So even the example that you had here, oh, well, museum's a place for white people. Black folks don't go there. So how do you connect with, whether, again, I'm at the museum or I'm with the symphony orchestra or I'm at a business and we're trying to sell into new markets? How do you create these new relationships across communities? Because you've talked about interpersonal relationships, building bridges one-on-one. Mm-hmm. Within an intra-organizational bridges between departments, but how do you make even maybe that longest bridge across an organization and communities that it has not connected with in the past?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the sort of big umbrella of all of this work. It's like it's set in community engagement, right? Yeah. It's just being really intentional about the work that we're doing. So I'll give you an example. I think soon after I arrived here, I was introduced to some folks at MIAD. Mm-hmm. And I was invited over there to take a tour of the building. I think it was about 2 hours.
And it's the Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I don't know, 20 minutes into the space in the conversation, I was inspired because you actually had students work on display, right? And so I left there with the question, like, who do I talk to next to figure out how to begin to have a conversation about how we do some work across our institutions. And I met a gentleman named Brad, and we began to talk about this idea that we have here to do some work in the Africa exhibit. And it was quickly, well, is there anyone in the space that you know in your network that are expert, scholars or community members who can really speak to what they think should be represented in that Africa Gallery space? Because it needs to tie, that space itself needs to probably tie back to the Wisconsin or Milwaukee community. Mm. And so we want people who are actually sitting in this space, who've lived in this space, to actually come into conversation about how it should look and how it should be represented. So much of the work is grounded in community engagement. So whether it's designing a new space at the museum or talking to folks outside about the museum, either way, we have to start to go to folks, and we have to also just sort of bring folks into the space. So it's this sort of bi-directional relationship with the community, and also bi-directional relationship with folks inside of the space, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I hear a few themes there for our listeners. One, like positions like yours, where it's like, hey, somebody who can focus and specialize on this. But then also you mentioned being intentional and setting up programs, but then also outreach, but also changing what's happening inside. So there's a reason for people who you're reaching out to see themselves in once you bring them in. And that's a whole lot of bridges that you're building there. And I'd like to provide a little space for you to talk about We Bridge Belonging. So you were talking about that before, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what it is, about the impact it's had, and just share the awesomeness about it with our listeners.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that opportunity. And I think it's wise for me to sort of back into it, right? And I think I mentioned at the onset that I've lived in multiple places, but I was the Caribbean kid who ended up in Maine, from the Virgin Islands, and the college going process was incredibly challenging for me. For example, I only applied to one college, that one college in Maine. I only did it because my high school basketball coach essentially came to me and said, I think I call it the last hour. It was my senior year, and he was like, "Hey, Rhoan, a couple of guys had gone to this school in Maine. I think it'd be a good fit." So I ended up going off to school there in Maine. But I was also very much an independent student, so I had to work and support myself. And there was a situation where I couldn't be deemed as an independent student because I wasn't of a certain age. And so what I decided to do was to take that time off until I became that age, and I went back. So essentially it took me 8 years to get through my undergrad. And then I went to work at Bowdoin College in Maine, and a good part of my role there was interacting with communities. And there are these college access community-based organizations that I interacted with. And I was really fascinated with how they were actually engaging with students and advising students about the college going process. And I'll share an example where I'm at Bowdoin and I get a call from a counselor, not the parent of this young person, not the college counselor from the school that the student came from, but from someone at the community-based organization asking me if I'd seen this young person recently. And I said, yes. And they asked me how they were doing. And I said, well, I think everything seems to be fine. And she said, no, if it were up to him, he'd be back home here in Chicago tomorrow. He's not actually having a good time. And I found that to be really fascinating. In fact, it made me thought like, wow, I mean, what if every young person had this? What if every young person had that community, that those kind of relationships that they can connect to facilitate these other relationships for them? So I took that and I went to grad school, wanting to make better sense of how we do that. And so my graduation, or my dissertation work was grounded in a sense of belonging. How do we create a better sense of belonging for students on college campuses? And that's how that sort of the name came through of wanting to bridge belonging for young people in the post-secondary space. A lot of that work right now is I've done some work with Bank of America. I've done some work with Mentor, and I'm in some other conversation with some other organization about how do we build better systems for young people. And a lot of that is just really based in network. And I want to say this, Justin, that I think oftentimes when we think of mentoring, we often think of mentoring as this sort of very individualized thing where it's an adult person with a young person. And we should really think about it as sort of network mentoring, right? Right. In a situation where a young person would have come to me and tell me they're interested in, say, the school I went to, and I couldn't have that conversation. And suddenly I realized that they might want to major in something that I don't have a background in. So I could say, you know what, my buddy, I'm introduced to my buddy, Justin. He majored in that particular discipline. And while you're having a conversation, maybe if something else comes up and you say, I'll connect you to another person. And all of a sudden, there's 3 people in that young person's network that they can reach out to and be in touch with questions. And I think that's where the real meaningful impact is. And so much of my work has been around building specifications about how we actually do that work for young people at scale. So essentially, it's scaling those community-based organizations so that more young people will actually flourish in their pursuits.
So you've shared a lot about building bridges and building all these connections. So how can our listeners remain connected with you?
You know, folks can find me at LinkedIn. My name is Rhoan Garnett, RHOAN GARNETT.
All right. Thank you very much, Rhoan Garnett, for spending some time with us and teaching us some things.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much, Justin.
And thank you to all of you for spending some time with us and listening in for this week's episode of the Uplifting Impact Podcast. And you know what? We need more people like you to uplift the impact. In order to do so, be sure to share this episode, comment on it by going to our website at upliftingimpact.com, or provide your thoughts directly to us through LinkedIn at Uplifting Impact, or looking for Justin Ponder and Deanna Singh. And until next week, keep uplifting the impact.